Hello, welcome to my video about South Africa. We can start about the history. Before the 1600s, South Africa was mostly populated by tribes that consisted of agriculturists and herdsmen that lived very primitively compared to the 1600s Europeans. Hello Matilda. The Xhosa and Zulu groups were the biggest tribes. Then later, in the 1600s, the Dutch started to colonize South Africa. They started to colonize South Africa and use their cities as trade and resupply points. They also brought a lot of slaves to South Africa to actually sustain these trade ports and resupply points. When the Dutch colonized the East, they were in a series of wars with the Xhosa people, and they fought about their land because the Dutch tried to push them out, and because the Dutch were better equipped, they were successful. Then later in the 1800s, when this had been going on for 200 years, the British started coming to South Africa too, because the French had started to take over Northern Africa and were going down to South Africa. So the British wanted to hold South Africa to keep it from falling into French hands. Then later in the 1900s, Nelson Mandela was born in 1918. I'll talk more about him later because he is his own subject to talk about. And the First and Second World War rolled around, and exactly after the Second World War, the South African government established apartheid. Apartheid is a system of racial segregation established to create a white power in South Africa. So the white minority could have power even though there were mostly black people in South Africa. This system was going on to 1994 when apartheid ended. And yeah, that's the history. Now on to the next point. Now on to the second point of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was born in 1918 in Mweso, South Africa. If you know a little about South African history and history in all, you know that he was the first black president in South Africa, and he was the president that ended apartheid. Before apartheid, he studied law and worked as a lawyer in Johannesburg. When apartheid was implemented, he joined the ANC, which is anti-colonial and African nationalist politics. So it means that they're against the colonists. They want to have power in South Africa because they're the original people from there, and they don't want any foreigners having the power of their country. He worked against the system of apartheid and segregation, and was arrested multiple times. But one time in 1968, he was sentenced to life in prison because he was in a protest. So he was in prison almost all his life. In 27 years, he was in prison 27 years. And after that, when he was let out in 1990 by the president, F.W. de Klerk, he wanted the president of South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, he wanted to negotiate the end of apartheid because he didn't think it was fair. So they were negotiating a lot, and then in 1994, Apartheid ended, and Nelson Mandela became the first black president with the help of the ANC. Life under apartheid. Uh, the difference between black and white people during apartheid was enormous. Uh, if you were white, you could live in a nice apartment, maybe live in a house. You could work with what you wanted, and you could do things that you actually wanted. But if you were black, it was a lot different. Uh, Black people couldn't have every job they wanted because they were seen as lower, so they could only get basic jobs and minimum wage. They couldn't live everywhere they wanted. Like example, they couldn't live where the white people lived because that was seen as like white only apartments, and they were nicer and yeah, they were nicer and a lot more like beautifully made because the government cared about the white people, but they didn't really care about the black people. So the black people, they lived in townships, is what it's called. Townships are small towns that are very crammed and made with poor structures. Like it can be a metal plate as a roof, maybe just bricks stacked as walls, and it's a very poor environment for a person to live in. But they were made to live there. They were placed in a township, so you couldn't move to a township. You were placed in a township, and you were segregated from the rest of the world. You could go into the city to work, and the only job you can get in the city was like if you were a maid or a cleaner, because you weren't seen as good as white people, so you could only get maintenance jobs like maid or cleaners. But during apartheid, there was a lot of white people who didn't agree with the system either. So they may be like in Trevor Noah's case. Trevor Noah is a colored man from South Africa. He had a white dad and a black mom, and he lived with his mom because he couldn't be seen with his dad because it was a crime for white and black people to have sex and make kids. So it was a problem. He couldn't be seen with his dad, so he lived with his mom, and they rented an apartment from a Dutch man because he didn't think the system of apartheid was fair either. So you if you found it, you could rent an apartment from a Dutch, from someone European, from some white person, but it was rare and it didn't happen that much. And if you were caught walking around in the white neighborhoods after a certain time, you could get a fine or even be in jail. And in Trevor Noah's case, like I talked a little about, his mom was she didn't work as a maid, but she always wore a maid outfit because it was the easiest to move around when you wore a maid outfit, because people thought you were working instead of just walking around, maybe walking with your kid. And that's how they walked around the city and disguised themselves in a white neighborhood, so they actually could survive there because they didn't want to live in a township. Life in South Africa today. There's still a divide between black and white people. There is still segregation, even though it isn't. Even though black people can do the things white people can, uh, it's like they're not given the opportunity to actually do it. They don't have the right opportunity to maybe go to the right school. They don't have the opportunity to get the right work, and things like that. So there's still a segregation. They don't have the opportunity to make the right money so they can move out of townships. Because townships, even though apartheid ended, they still exist because it's cheap housing, and it's needed because there's so many people. So there's still a difference compared to Sweden. This is so like extremely wild. We in Sweden, we can't imagine how it is to live like this, because we are a very diverse country, and it's like in Sweden everyone has the same opportunity. Maybe you don't have the same opportunity because you have ADHD, but that's not anything racial. So compared to Sweden, it's almost wild. Maybe we think we don't have a diverse system because colored people and people that just moved here live in maybe poor housing environments, but the things we call poor housing is so extremely much better than the townships black people live in South Africa still today. If you compare on Dollar Street, which is a website where you can compare families from around the world and their living standards, we in Sweden live on about $2,000 a month, which is roughly 20,000 crowns. Where in South Africa they live on about $300 a month, which is roughly 3,000 crowns. And in South Africa, if you look at Dollar Street, there is one white family on the Dollar Street map, if you say so, and they earn almost double of what the black families in South Africa earn. They earn $600 a month and live like a normal family, while the black people in South Africa earn lots less and live in these townships and maybe more poor areas. I think that we should be very grateful that we live in Sweden, because we have such a diverse and rich country. So even that our poor housing is a lot better than their poor housing, and I think you should see the good things in your life, because at least you can get food on your table. That was my video of the history and story about South Africa and apartheid. My sources are Gapminder's Dollar Street. If you go to gapminder.org, and the CIA's information about South Africa, if you go to cia.gov. That's my links. Thank you for listening to my video. Bye bye.